Hello, my dear viewers. I'm Olga Demchuk, a researcher of the inner world of the personality. Today, I want to touch on a difficult topic, but this is a thoughtful audience, and I believe we can meet it together. I want to talk about something many people recognize in their own lives. You read books, you watch psychological videos, you go to lectures, some even go to therapy or personal analysis, and yet real change doesn't seem to happen. Everything appears to stay just the same. What are we actually working with? When that kind of understanding is missing, instead of truly working on ourselves, we often begin to do the complete opposite. And many people who speak a lot about the psyche, who teach and explain it, are not themselves an example of clear thinking and sound judgment. In other words, there's this sort of theoretical cushion, a theoretical cloud that hangs somewhere above me, but it's as if my core essence doesn't change. So what's the reason for this? Today, I've come to you with some hand-drawn comics on this topic. We're going to go through them one by one. To help you understand this material better, I suggest that you get a notebook or even just a blank sheet of paper and draw along with these comics as you follow the explanations, meaning try to carefully sketch everything out by hand, step by step. This approach will help you to create a much more complete and detailed picture in your mind. All right, so our first comic, the first drawing. Here there are simply two circles drawn. In one circle we have I1 and in the second I2. And the question is, who am I? Is this me? If we jump ahead a little bit, this I is a kind of fantasy-based idea of oneself. When I've talked in my videos about the ideal self, I see that it creates some confusion. It's, more accurate to call it the fantasy self or the invented self. It's what I've made up about myself, what I want to think about myself. And it isn't necessarily something idealistic. For example, a person might be in a victim state or in a state of being, enlightened, or on the contrary, feeling like they're not needed by anyone. So it's an invented idea about oneself that doesn't correspond to reality. And I too is the real idea of oneself. Why did I choose the number 1 for this I? Because this I appears first. It's our foundation. And the sphere of the invented self can be replaced by this sphere or circle of I too, the real self, only when a person gets to know themselves realistically. Meaning they don't invent or fantasize things about themselves, but rather they record the facts like a dashcam in a car. And when we understand that the foundation, the base, is the invented self, well, a child simply lacks the intellect and life experience to form a realistic idea of themselves. Therefore, we originate from the invented self, and our realistic self can emerge to a greater or lesser extent. So don't see it as this is the invented self and this is the real self. These two processes, they flow into one another. Sometimes I'm more invented, sometimes less. This splitting allows us to tailor reality to our own liking, meaning everything that doesn't fit the image of my invented self, I can, as it's called in psychology, project either onto someone else or onto my real self. And an example of this is self-attacks, when we attack ourselves, when we scold ourselves, for instance. At that moment, this splitting is felt most vividly. But it also exists at other times. And this working on yourself, this ongoing work on yourself, it doesn't become work on your real self. It's as if the person perceives their real self as some kind of flaw that they need to fix. Like a master who would want his servants to be more skilled at serving him, so that this little mare I'm riding would be more beautiful. This is especially evident in how a person treats their body when they're dissatisfied with it, as if the body is not I, or as if their mistakes are not I. And in sessions, in private sessions or in groups, I see how a person speaks about themselves with contempt. Oh, how infantile I am. How could I have done that? This is a demonstration of that internal split. Let's go further and make this picture more three-dimensional. The second diagram. Here, a high pedestal is drawn on which I-1 is placed, the invented fantasy self, and here is the real self. And when a person has an idea of themselves that is too disconnected from reality, and notice this isn't when I'm just embellishing myself, but when I'm severely out of sync with reality, then an encounter with one's real self will be perceived as a fall from some pedestal or from the heavens. This is our emotional experience. No, that can't be. I couldn't have said that. I've heard this many times. And then when the person, if there was a recording, thank God, a video, they can watch the video and see how they actually behaved, what they said. But this rejection, no, I couldn't have said that. I watched myself and didn't recognize myself. It indicates that the way I fantasize about myself and the way I actually look, as they say, from the outside, are two mismatched images. That's precisely why a kind of collapse occurs. It's as if what I was standing on, my invented idea of myself, crumbles and I lose the ground under my feet. I fall down. And this kind of collapse, this sudden downfall, it can be from a greater or lesser height. Meaning if I already have an objective idea of myself, more or less, then even in moments of trouble, of collapse, or conversely, when I'm praised, I won't soar up or fall down. I'll stay at approximately the same level. In other words, this reality-based idea of myself gives me the feeling of having ground under my feet, of stability. My self-image doesn't depend so much on external changing circumstances, on how other people treat me. And this isn't a dismissive attitude toward the opinions of others. Rather, it's because I have an objective idea of myself. I can understand whether a person is close to reality when they say something about me or if they're far from it. Are they devaluing me right now or idealizing me? And thanks to this stability, a person begins to trust themselves more, at the very least. Let's move on. As I mentioned at the beginning, all this badness that gets packed into the real self, when a person scolds themselves, is an example of our failure to identify with our real self. I'll talk about this process in more detail in the webinar because it's a key one, and the format of this video doesn't allow for a full description. So if anyone wants to delve deeper into this devaluation, this packing of badness into the real self, then I suggest you explore other videos on this channel and read my first book. But here I'll just say that the real self's inability to fully accommodate all my desires and all my ideas of how things should be makes the relationship with it one of dominance and inner pressure. And that's why a person ends up in situations where they are dominated or where they dominate others. This stems from that process. Let's look at another aspect of this relationship. This is the distance between I1 and I2, the invented self and the real self. There are two spheres here with an arrow between them. And this is the distance between the real self and the invented self. In other words, what path do I need to take to meet my real self? And of course, our psyche looks for something simple, quick, and effortless. However, letting others know about yourself is a demanding process, and our psyche simply shuts down when it doesn't want to know something. It becomes deaf and blind. I think you can recall times when something was too much for you to take in and you reacted with the words, "That can't be, that's impossible." This is a defense against reality. And in fact, this path of self-discovery that we're talking about, the one you ask questions about, is precisely the path from the invented self to the real self. Because you can only take action from the real self. This leads to empty fantasies or unrealizable plans. They aren't aligned with reality, which is why the person is constantly unsuccessful. In other words, what they plan doesn't come to fruition. And of course, the greater this distance, the more a person will have to work to understand themselves, to let in this realistic perception of who they are. And you can only change what's realistic because we just replace a fantasy with another fantasy. It's still a fantasy, just a different one. And that's why a person develops a sense of being an imposter, a fear of being exposed, a feeling of pretense, and so on. This pretense, this broadcasting of a certain image to the world, is an attempt to get confirmation that my invented self is in fact real. This makes a person excessively tired. It's energy intensive. And we'll talk about this energy consumption when we look at our next drawing. A gap between the invented self and the real self can only exist if a person makes a constant effort. In other words, being in your real self is natural, but being in your invented self is energy intensive. You're constantly maintaining it because you want to appear different than you really are, not just to other people, but to yourself as well. It's the pose we strike when looking in the mirror, trying to find a way to stand to look better, sucking in our stomach, for example. Or when passing by shop windows, we see ourselves and fix something. And this gap, it takes a colossal amount of energy from the person themselves. That is, for a person to maintain this fabrication, they need to constantly pump themselves up as if with propaganda. That's how propaganda works. It constantly broadcasts this idea that differs from the realistic picture, and it's always emotionally charged. So if we shorten the distance between these selves, as in the previous drawing, and get closer to a realistic perception of ourselves, our energy consumption decreases significantly. And then we can spend the energy that's been freed up on something else. Sometimes we even engage in activities that are unpleasant to us, but which support this invented image. It's the profession we're in, or the circle of people we socialize with. So we're constantly, as if, forcing our invented image onto reality, confirming it every time we pay attention to ourselves. And this manipulation of facts forces us to reshape reality and make it completely unrecognizable. That's why we can't analyze events in our lives, because we've already manipulated the facts to fit our invented image. And this manipulation prevents us not only from analyzing, but from thinking at all, because thinking is the processing of facts. It's a block on our thinking, and specifically a block on getting smarter. Because if I get smarter, I'll understand everything, and then what do I do? Where do I run? So you can't get smarter, you can't remember, and you constantly have to clean up your memory. And you have to pull in other people to make this picture work somehow, to make others guilty. And because of this inability to take responsibility for my specific actions, a person can't understand their share of responsibility, what exactly they, and only they, brought to the situation. So it turns out that living with these manipulated facts, I can either blame myself for everything or completely absolve myself of any guilt. But neither of those is the truth. Our next drawing is about the intriguing unknown. When a person first begins the often challenging and rewarding process of self-discovery, they first have to learn to work with projections. A projection is when you believe someone else is to blame for your life being the way it is. And a person who projects onto someone else, for example, labeling them as scary to justify their own anger, or they say, "You're the one who wants to leave me, not me." That's what happens with jealousy, for example. So this inability to own one's feelings creates a void when a person tries to figure out where to go from their invented self. I want you to understand this and to understand what a difficult path it is. In other words, I'm used to living in my invented self. Everything is already perfected. The reflex arcs are established. The scripts of my invented stories have been rehearsed on stage. And now it's as if I have to start a completely different life, to see differently, to perceive differently, to think differently. It means having completely different eyes, ears, and a different mind. And asking a person to step from their invented self into their real self is the same as asking them to step into a void. In other words, this realistic self-image appears gradually. It swirls around. And at some point it becomes more appealing because it's clearer, more reliable, more stable, and more effective. But you have to wait for that. It doesn't appear right away. You have to understand that it takes time. And in fact, the person is like a tenant who has to move their belongings from one house to another. Yes, but that's a metaphor. But in reality, our idealistic or conversely negative self-image, our invented self-image, the walls of that house must gradually be replaced by a new house. Essentially, we are dissolving that self. Working with the invented image of oneself is about dissolving that self. But you need to have a place you can move into. And this realistic self-image, how to achieve it. All our videos are about this. It's when we explore ourselves, when we speak honestly about ourselves instead of theorizing, when we are able to withstand the truth about ourselves. The next drawing. Well, this is what I actually started this video with. It's about when a person accumulates a huge amount of knowledge, reads a lot, and we see this inflation of their invented self-image. It's as if the person is a great theorist, but not a practitioner at all. And when a person learns about psychology, they start to think they're an expert, that they know everything about people and that everyone else is a fool. And they treat their own self like a fool as well. In other words, their sense of grandeur grows. This is pseudo-knowledge. If while absorbing knowledge, I start to feel this inflation, this sense of superiority, it means the process of transformation is not happening. And you can watch videos endlessly, and after each video, crushingly attack yourself. And this crushing, when you attack yourself with such devastation, it doesn't allow you to change. You can't even perceive information clearly, precisely because that attack will follow. So all the negativity is directed at the real self, while the invented self remains, as it were, untouched. And I see this very clearly in my sessions. For example, when a person has this large distance between these two eyes, or a great height, whichever you prefer, both metaphors reflect the process. It's as if I'm hitting a smooth, indestructible surface without even leaving a scratch. In other words, the person is on the defensive. They don't want to reconsider their invented image. Because the reality you offer them seems disgusting from the perspective of this invented world. I see it when we manage to process something in a session, but the person comes back next time, and they're exactly the same. And it's as if I constantly have to come up with new ways just to make a tiny scratch on this invented image. In the invented image, the person is most often a martyr who tolerates others, who even tolerates their own disgusting self. You see, it doesn't matter what the projection is, that I am disgusting or that the world is disgusting. This "the world is disgusting" or "I am disgusting" indicates that this splitting is present, that the person is a fan, a cultist of their own invented self. When a person starts working on themselves and works only with the invented self, it's always this desire to become better. It's about better. I will become better. It's not "I will get to know myself." It's "I will become better." And when a person moves within this framework, they are not working with their real self. So there can be a huge absorption of books, knowledge, lectures, but no change happens. The absorption happens, and through this absorption, the invented self grows even larger. It has decided that it knows. Another drawing about flexibility and rigidity. The invented self is rigid. It's a foreign object in this reality. It cannot change. You can look at how a personality changes, whether it's capable of changing, capable of thinking differently, even looking different, or has it frozen in one image, the very same one. But the real self is plastic because the invented self shatters against reality, while the real self, it adapts to reality without losing its individuality. And so in the invented self, you find the same scenarios over and over because it acts as if it's following a script it wrote for itself. That's why they end up in the same situations, the same problems, and even have approximately the same income. And even if their income grows, it happens at the cost of incredible effort. Meaning the person constantly feels like they're doing hard labor because they constantly have to be in opposition to reality. Remember, I said a huge amount of energy is spent on maintaining this gap. Our final comic strip. Here, the invented self is depicted with thick walls. It's locked up, focused only on itself. And so its attitude toward the outside world is utilitarian. That is, it wants to use it to make it its own habitat. And it doesn't want to give anything back. It tolerates people, it doesn't understand them. It doesn't create anything for the society it lives in, for the country it lives in. It's like constantly dragging things into its own burrow. More supplies, more knowledge, such greed. And even if the person does something for others, it's an imitation, like a social smile, an imitation. Meaning they do it because they understand it's advantageous for them. But that desire to give back, the desire to care for society, is absent here. And another important point is that many people don't understand the difference between emotions and feeling. In the invented self, there are always a lot of emotions because emotion is a product of our subjectivity. We get emotional, we get angry or suffer when things don't go our way. But to sensually experience the world you're in, to sensually experience contact, to sensually experience another person, that is something completely different. Being emotional about a person versus experiencing or creating a sensual contact, these are worlds apart. They are not at all alike. And many people think that if they are overly emotional, it means they are emotional or sensitive. No, they might just be too fixated on themselves. Because in the sensual experience of the world, there are no excessive emotions. There, you have a huge spectrum of these emotions, a huge variety, but here it's one single all-consuming emotion. And that's why a person in the invented self doesn't feel that they are living, that they are embodied, that this life is passing through them. They always have the feeling that they are somewhere separate from that life, separate from people, separate from the country, separate from the community where they are. And even in a group, it's as if they are not part of it. To tell them we're doing this together, to praise someone, to admire someone's, say, intelligence, it's impossible for them because it's as if they're being robbed of what they believe belongs to them. Everything is mine. So that's the story I've laid out in these comics. Please share your comments, write about the processes you already see within yourselves, And perhaps you'll be among those who want to share, who want to give something back, and who will post some interesting examples from your life related to these points. And just observe. If you don't feel like writing comments, don't want to leave a like, don't want to participate, don't want to interact with other people, just try to realize where that's coming from. And if this way of looking at yourself feels close to you, you're welcome to stay here on the channel. Later, we'll talk specifically about how the invented self devalues reality, how it happens in more detail with examples. And we'll discuss, and for me, this is the most important part, how to perceive things without judgment, how that unburdens us, and how much smarter we can be, because we can operate with more facts when they aren't emotionally charged, when there's less of the invented in them. I'll say goodbye for now. See you next time.